And hello, everyone. Welcome to Season 3, Episode 8 now of our International Perspectives on Corpus Technology for Language Learning online seminar series, organized by myself here at the University of Queensland and our partners at the State University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, UNESP. Today, our illustrious speaker is Dr. Luciana Forti, who is going to be talking today about integrating SLA evidence into DDL effects-oriented research, which is an important milestone for studies in DDL if we are able to make or truly achieve the link between SLA theory and research and what we are doing as corpus-based language teaching, data-driven learning. So it's going to be a really interesting take on where we're at with that, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Just before we begin, I'd just like to, of course, acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet tonight, or this afternoon, or this morning, wherever you are, while paying our respects to their ancestors and descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. And we recognize their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. So our presenter today, Luciana, is a researcher and lecturer in applied linguistics at the University for Foreigners of Perugia in Italy. Her main research interest includes second language acquisition, corpus linguistics, and lexicology, with a specific focus on data-driven learning and phraseology. She teaches second language acquisition theories and research methods. And her monograph entitled Corpus Use in Italian Language Pedagogy, Exploring the Effects of Data-Driven Learning, is due out in March 2023 with Routledge. So, Luciana, welcome to the series. It's a pleasure to have you on. And I'll now let you begin your screen sharing and to begin the presentation.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you everyone for joining me today. It's a real pleasure to be here today with you. I will start sharing my screen. You should be able to see my slides now. Can you just confirm just by saying yes or no?
Everything is fine.
Okay, great. So yes, thank you so much for being here. It's a real honor for me to have been invited to this very excellent and prestigious and important seminar series. Just see. Okay, so here's the outline of my talk. I will quickly go over the meaning of data-driven learning effects-oriented research, and I will just summarize the ways in which this specific kind of DDL research has developed over the years. I will then point out how SLA evidence can be connected with DDL research in relation to the DDL potential with respect to language learning and teaching. And then I will present a specific case related to the different lines of research that I've been working on ever since starting my PhD, which focus on the effects of data-driven learning on L2 Italian phraseological competence development. So as you probably all know, it's quite easy to define data-driven learning in broad terms. One of the most frequently used definitions is the one provided in 2010 by Jalcan and Granger, according to whom data-driven learning can be defined as using the tools and techniques of corpus linguistics for pedagogical purposes. This is has been a very successful definition because it's broad enough to englobe all the different kinds of data-driven learning varieties that we can actually create for learners and for language learning purposes. However, there has been some more detail in defining data-driven learning, especially ever since Leach introduced the direct versus indirect uses of corpus data for language learning purposes. And also ever since Granger introduced the concept of immediate versus delayed uses of corpus data for language learning purposes. And so stemming from these two dichotomies, we can actually develop this kind of graph where we see that the pedagogical uses of corpus data can be actually divided into the direct uses of corpus data, where corpus data is explicitly and immediately visible to learners, and then the indirect uses of corpus data where this does not actually happen, where corpus data is not explicitly and immediately visible to the learners. And we can see that these two different areas in the use of corpus data for pedagogical purposes lead to other ways of implementing these approaches. So in terms of direct uses, we can have a computer-based approach, or we can also have a paper-based approach, and each of these two approaches can be either concordance-based or non-concordance-based. You probably know that the most typical version of data-driven learning is the concordance-based version, but especially in the last few years with technological developments that have contributed to developments in terms of how corpus data can be visualized, we know now that concordance-based DDL is not the only kind of DDL that is possible. On the other hand, in terms of the indirect uses, we have seen several examples of corpus data being used for syllabi and curriculum development, in pedagogical lexicography, in language testing, in the context of language learning course books. And of course, at a more sophisticated level, we have seen cases in which findings from corpus linguistics and learner corpus research can inform these different areas. However, today we will focus on data-driven learning, so and more specifically on concordance-based data-driven learning. And of course, we have to remember that the direct use of corpus data with language learners does not occur in a vacuum. It has some strong theoretical grounding, which has been uncovered by a number of scholars, especially the past few years. Links have been made to a number of theories pertaining to both language and language learning, such as constructivism, sociocultural theory, noticing hypothesis, usage-based approaches, and other theoretical frameworks as well. Let's see what we mean by DDL-effects-oriented research. In a nutshell, we can define it as the research that is based on the collection, analysis, and interpretation of empirical data that is related to the effects that DDL has on learning with respect to a specific language focus or attitudes of the learners that engage in corpus-based activities, or the behavior that the learners have while engaging in corpus-based activities. Today, I will focus on the first aspect, so the effects that DDL has on learning with respect to a specific language focus. What do we mean by language focus? Thanks to a couple of meta-analyses that have been published in 2017 and 2018, these are the most recent meta-analyses, which have tried to take into account how DDL effects vary according to language learning aims. They have actually identified which language learning aims we are talking about. So these can be divided into aims relating to language skills, so listening, speaking, writing, reading, or translating, and language aspect, vocabulary, grammar, and discourse. One key question is the following: what do we know about the challenges that second language learners encounter in these areas? What do we know about difficulties in language writing, in writing in a second language or in a specific language area like vocabulary or lexical grammar? In other words, what do we know about the second language acquisition empirical evidence that is related to these learning aims? Let's consider the case of phraseology. As you know, this is an area that's been investigated quite a lot, both in corpus linguistics and in learner corpus research and in psycholinguistics, and in more generally speaking in second language acquisition studies, because it's widely recognized that phraseology plays a key role in the development of second language competence. So, what do we know about the challenges that language learners encounter in relation to phraseology? Three aspects relate to these properties that characterize phraseological units. First one is semantic opacity. We know that many phraseological units, and actually one defining variable of phraseological units is the fact that a phraseological unit may be made up of several words which are not entirely transparent on a semantic level. So not all the words in a combination of words will be used in its literal sense. An example is to make a stand. This especially happens with high frequency verbs, for example. And there have been studies pointing out the potential difficulties that learners can have in relation to this aspect of phraseology. Another aspect that has been taken into account is frequency in input. So not only are these phraseological units potentially opaque semantically, but they can be also potentially infrequent. And when any item of language is potentially infrequent, this can be problematic because learners will not have enough exposure to ignite things like priming effects or learning in general. They're not exposed to a combination for long enough to actually acquire that combination. Another issue relates to congruency, to the cases in which phraseological units lack congruency with the mother tongue. This is the case of to take a photo, which in Italian corresponds to fare una foto. In these cases, we can see that the verb does not have a correspondence in terms of its literal meaning. So there is a different verb that is selected by the same noun when we compare these two languages. And this has also been studied at length as a potential challenge for learners. So the question is, can DDL help? Can DDL reach the parts other teaching can't reach? So as to quote a well-known article by Alex Bolton, and can DDL make a difference with respect to other possible teaching approaches? Let's see, if we consider concordance-based DDL, what is the potential of concordance-based DDL in relation to these three different issues? For opaque phraseological units, DDL can provide, of course, authentic examples displaying a variety of phraseological uses, and this can help learners identify differences between literal and non-literal uses because they are able to infer meaning from context, from the numerous examples of the same combination in context. For example, they can infer from the context of a concordance the difference in meaning that characterizes a combination such as raccontare una storia versus raccontare storie. So as you can see, even if you don't know Italian, we have the same words, the same verb and the same noun, the same combination. The only difference is that in one case we have a singular form and in the other case we have a plural form. But that's not the only difference. There is also a difference in meaning, which can be inferred from a specific context. In the first case, raccontare una storia, means simply to tell a story. And it's a combination that is mostly used in its literal sense. In the second case, in the plural form, raccontare storie will most likely refer to the fact that you're saying something that is not actually true. You're telling stories that you've made up. Infrequent phraseological units. In this case, of course, the potential of concordance-based DDL is quite clear. Concordance-based DDL can provide numerous examples for learners to explore, and this can sort of counterbalance the infrequency in input that certain phraseological units can be characterized by. And in this way, the frequency effects that are not spontaneously triggered by inputs can actually be triggered by the concordance lines. And for incongruent phraseological units, again, concordance-based DDL can provide numerous examples displaying the target language form meaning mappings. And this way, learners can build up awareness on the difference between the target language and the mother tongue. And this can help them avoid non-typical combinations. One example is dare un sorriso, which literally in English would mean to give a smile. In Italian, we have a combination to say to smile. We don't have a single verb. And this error has been observed a number of times in a corpus of Chinese learners of Italian. And it's actually the result of a non-typical selection of the verb, because the typical selection of the verb would be fare. The correct form of this expression is fare un sorriso. And overall, the other aspect that can make concordance-based DDL potentially useful for learners is that the concordance-based DDL will be based on a guided discovery approach, making learning experiences more memorable. And this can help learners counterbalance the challenges that they may encounter. But what does it mean to conduct a DDL effects-oriented research in relation to Italian language learning? Let's have a look at the state of the art concerning DDL as a whole, and then concerning DDL for Italian. The latest review has been published by Bolton and Yachina in 2021, and it's a great review because it builds up on the previously published meta-analyses, but it has a somewhat broader perspective. So it includes not only a very strict selection of empirical studies that have adopted quantitative methods, but also studies pertaining to learner attitudes and learner behaviors when engaging in corpus-based activities. It's a great review also because it covers 3 decades, starting from 1989, ending in 2019. And this review uncovered a total of 489 papers. I believe that now the number of papers has risen, but this is the latest published finding that we have. And as you can see, over the years, there's been quite a steady increase. But how many of these have focused on L2 Italian? The great thing about this paper is that it's open access, not only in terms of the article itself, but in terms of the supplementary materials. On IRIS, you can freely download the coding sheet that the authors used. So you can have a list of the full list of the 489 papers coded according to a number of variables, including the target language involved in each of those studies. So I had a look at the target language involved in each study. I looked for Italian, and I found only 9 papers, which are actually authored by 3 people, and one of them is me. So as you can see, there is really not much out there. However, the review conducted by Bolton and Yachina takes into account only papers published in English. So I had a look at papers published also in Italian, and I tried to sort of merge the data they obtained. I found 26 papers As you can see, over the years, the publication of papers on DDL for Italian has been quite irregular. And most of the papers, especially the ones published in Italian, are largely descriptive and introductory, so aimed at readers who know nothing about Corpora and nothing about data-driven learning. So there's still a lot to do. Let's have a look at the learner-friendly corpus resources that are available for Italian. To the best of my knowledge, the only corpus exploration tool that has been created specifically for language learners of Italian is SLA. You probably know what I'm talking about. It's a great tool. It selects 40 good examples for learners from an Italian web corpus of about 320 million words. It provides word sketches such as this one for amore, which means love, and also clouds, which incorporate similar words that can include also synonyms, but not necessarily. There are, of course, other corpus-based resources that describe a certain variety of Italian language, or that are actually reference corpora. However, these corpora have been mainly created for corpus linguists, so not specifically for language learners. Some of these have developed pedagogical materials as an aid to be more relevant for the language learning context. However, most of these require some form of adaptation for most pedagogical contexts. So what I will be talking to you about today refers to the studies that I conducted ever since starting my PhD. So it's basically a synthesis of research that I've published in several articles and in one forthcoming book. Here I just inserted the link to the description of the book, which is due out in a few months. These are the research questions that over the years I've dealt with. So the first research question is quite broad. I wanted to investigate how DDL can influence the learning of collocations overall without taking into account specific properties of the learning aims. However, then looking closely at the literature on how collocations are learned and seeing how different properties are taken into account, I wanted to see how these properties influenced these effects of DDL. So I asked, well, what effect does DDL have on learning semantically opaque and semantically transparent collocations? And how does DDL influence the learning of these collocations that can be either opaque or transparent semantically in relation to their frequency? And then I looked at congruency as well. So what effect does DDL have on learning congruent and incongruent collocations? And how does DDL influence the learning of congruent and incongruent collocations in relation to their frequency? So I'll now briefly take you through the method that I developed to tackle these research questions. So I needed an experimental design that would allow me to compare different groups in relation to different exposure to different kinds of materials. So the design that I adopted was a controlled design, a longitudinal design, and a between groups design. I collected empirical data through a phraseological competence test, which I developed, and that I administered at 4-week intervals over 12 weeks. In terms of the DDL treatment, I taught one 1-hour lesson a week for 8 weeks in 8 classes of pre-intermediate Chinese learners of Italian who were aged between 18 and 27. And I randomly assigned these 8 classes to either an experimental or a control or comparison condition. In total, I was able to involve 123 learners, 61 for the experimental group and 62 for the control group. And since collocations are a very complex category in Lexis, I focused exclusively on verb, noun, object collocations. I then needed to select the learning aims in a sort of principled way. So I looked at the LOCLI. The LOCLI is a longitudinal corpus of Chinese learners of Italian, which had been compiled just when I was beginning my research. So I extracted all the verb, noun, object combinations from this corpus. It was the ideal corpus to use because I had 8 classes of Chinese learners who were participating in my project, and I also had a corpus of written text produced by a comparable group of learners with the same mother tongue. After performing the error analysis, I selected 32 combinations, and I grouped them into themes that would then be the basis for my lesson planning. I then looked at a reference corpus because I wanted to integrate not only the knowledge on difficulties that Chinese learners had in relation to Italian phraseological units, but also what the phraseological units would be most convenient for them to learn in terms of frequency in the target language involved. So I looked at the PEC. The PEC is a reference corpus of Italian. I extracted all the verb, noun, object combinations. I selected another group of 32 combinations, and I integrated these with the themes that I had previously identified. So I tried to merge a sort of needs-driven selection with a target language-driven selection. And on this slide, you'll find the link that will take you to the webpage of all the corpora that have been developed at the University for Foreigners of Perugia. So this is what I ended up with, a list of 8 themes that would constitute the basis for each lesson that I would plan for every week, and each theme would be connected to 8 combinations deriving from either the LOCLI or the PEC. In terms of the lesson planning, each lesson followed the same sort of structure. So there was a sort of gamified introduction to the weekly collocations, followed by a set of activities for the DDL group, which were paper-based and which would be things like concordance-based matching, concordance-based gap fills, concordance-based pattern hunting, or concordance-based matching. Again, yeah, that's repeated. Then for the control groups, these were activities based on the same collocations, but following a different format. So there were no multiple sentence activities. All the activities were characterized by single sentences. So there would be things like matching single split sentences, single sentence gap fills, error correction, and so on. And then the lessons went on with some practice and production activities, with the homework assignment, and then an end of lesson game. Many lessons were fully gamified in the sense that, especially to sort of make the series of DDL activities more interesting, from the start of the lesson, I would create different groups, and these different groups had the aim of finding the pattern or solving the concordance-based problem that I would propose in the least amount of time possible. And of course, at the end of the lesson, there would always be a sort of winning team. So here's one example of DDL activity. In this activity, which I call the La metà mancante, the missing half, I would show the class half of a concordance. So a concordance that would be sort of cut up right after the verb. And I would ask the class to try to guess what word comes after the verb. So of course, they would start to make hypotheses, but each hypothesis would have to suit each one of these sentences. So there would be some first ideas which would be wrong because one idea that would suit the first sentence would then not suit the second one or the third one, and so on. They would obviously confer with one another to see what they could come up with, and then eventually I would give them the solution. Fare amicizia. After this first stage, I would then give different groups this set of cards with several concordances split in half. These cards would be numbered, and then there would be another set of cards with letters. So then they would basically have to match the two halves of the concordances. And obviously the team that was able to do this in the least amount of time would be the winning team. This is this matched non-DDL activity. So again, we have a matching exercise, but as you can see, the verbs and the nouns are completely decontextualized. In this case, the learners had to come up with the number of overall combinations that are possible between these two lists, so the list of verbs and the list of nouns. And in this case, the solution would be 18. Here's another sample DDL activity. This time, we have a multiple sentence gap fill. So it's a traditional gap fill, but presented in the form of a concordance. So there are 8 combinations presented in a concordance that is gapped in relation to the verb. And here's the matching non-DDL activity. Again, as you can see, there is no concordance, but just single sentences for each combination. There are a number of advantages involved in paper-based DDL. We don't see it very often because there is, and rightly so, great attention on new technologies in relation to how corpus data can be visualized in a more friendly way and in a more adaptable way in relation to actual learner needs. However, especially for languages that don't have that many corpus-based resources that are learner-friendly, paper-based DDL activities can have numerous advantages. With a paper-based activity, it is possible to adapt the corpus data to a proficiency level by curating the data. So avoiding specialist language or long subordinate clauses and other aspects that can actually not be particularly suitable for, say, an intermediate level of proficiency. And also it can help adapt an activity to the context. I was lucky enough to be able to involve 8 classes of Chinese learners of Italian. No class had computers, and the computer lab in my university would not have been able to accommodate 103 students, or it would have been logistically quite difficult even to have a rotation and actually bring the 8 classes to the computer lab. Another advantage consists in the opportunity of integrating paper-based DDL material with other paper-based materials, and this can actually help also with the normalization of DDL in teaching practices. It can be flexibly used. A paper-based DDL activity can be used even if there was no plan to use it. And in terms of empirical research, using paper-based DDL activity can allow rigorous control over corpus input, and this can be good because you can actually be sure about what corpus input there is, and it can also be good for replications. Let's now see how I developed the phraseological competence test. So of course, this test had to match the learning aims quite closely. So it was a 64-item phraseological competence test divided into multiple choice items and gap fill items. So there were 32 target combinations based on Lockley and 32 combinations based on Peck. The 32 combinations based on the Lockley were multiple choice items because I was able to use the errors that I found in the learner corpus as distracted. This is another great area of research. I'm referring to the uses of Corpora in language testing. And I then created some gap fill items for the combinations that were actually based on the analysis deriving from the reference corpus PEC. And this is the data collection outline that I followed. So I started with the phraseological competence test in week 1, and then in week 4, then 8. And then I administered the last phraseological competence test 4 weeks after the end of the lesson series. And I did this to capture retention rates, to see actually how much was retained after the end of the lessons. Data coding, this was another crucial aspect of the study. I had to code the variables that I was interested in order to take them into account in the analysis. So coding semantic transparency was probably the most challenging aspect of the study. I asked 13 raters to rate the 64 collocations according to the categories found in Howard's phraseological continuum model. So they basically had to decide on different levels of semantic transparency. And it was quite hard to reach a good enough inter-annotator agreement rate. In order to reach that, I had to make a selection. So I reduced the 64 collocations to a sample of 32, exactly half. And that allowed me to identify the subset of collocations which had been given the most agreeing evaluations by the raters. So I was able to create a list of transparent items, of transparent collocations, such as ascoltare la musica, to listen to music, and then other collocations that were deemed more opaque, not necessarily fully opaque, but more opaque than transparent, such as avere un'idea, to have an idea. Coding congruency was not as challenging. I involved 2 different expert L1 Chinese speakers who categorized the 64 collocations according to congruency. There was not much disagreement, none at all, just a couple of cases were cases where they were both quite unsure, but they eventually made the same decision independently. And then phrasal frequency, which was operationalized as the overall number of co-occurring sequences present in a reference corpus of Italian. I used the PEC again. And I simply extracted the phrasal frequency using the query that you see on this slide for each of the 64 combinations. Then I analyzed the data through mixed effects modeling. This is just a summary of the variables and all the different levels. So the outcome variable was accuracy, correct or incorrect, according to how the learners responded to the test over time. So I considered the 4 tests. I considered, of course, the different properties of the learning aims, the 2 conditions, and also random effects. Apart from the challenges involved in coding the data, other challenges that I encountered refer to adapting the data from the Perugia corpus to suit a pre-intermediate proficiency level. There was no Italian version of SCAL at the time, and especially for DDL in Italian learning contexts, this is a topic that really needs to be addressed. Because apart from SCAL, the only research avenue and pedagogical avenue that can be followed is trying to be rigorous in how you adapt data from a reference corpus to create paper-based materials. Another challenge was that I expected a sort of homogeneous pre-intermediate level, but actually the level in each class varied, despite the fact that they were all classes that had been assigned through a placement test to the same level. So this is something that can happen when you plan, design a study involving many different classes of students. Another challenge that I think is important to address is the challenge of constructing a series of DDL activities that does not risk the learners to be bored at some point. So I tried to vary the format within each lesson. And then another challenge was a challenge that I encountered with the teachers. I was not responsible for these courses, so I was the researcher that went into other people's language courses. So it was quite, even though I had the university approval and everything, it was quite difficult to get accepted at first. All I was asking was 1 hour of class a week in each class, in each of the 8 classes, to teach my lessons. And it was difficult to get the teachers to collaborate in what I had to do at the end, that is the administration of the end of course questionnaire. This is something that I will not be talking about today, but there's also an aspect of my work that relates to learner attitudes. You can read about it in the 2 articles that I referred to on this slide. So research questions. Overall, how does DDL influence the learning of collocations overall? How does this influence relate to semantic opacity and frequency? And how does it relate to congruency and frequency? Let's have a look at the results. So in relation to the first research question, this is sort of the general finding from my study. As you can see, there is a very similar U-shaped learning curve in both conditions. So we can't see any striking differences between the 2 conditions, between the group of learners that were exposed to data-driven learning materials and the group of learners that were not exposed to data-driven learning materials. But what happens if we include semantic transparency into the picture? We see something like this. So again, we see some very similar patterns. We see the U-shaped learning curves again in both conditions, except for one case, the transparent items in the experimental condition. In this case, we don't see a sort of drop corresponding to the last data collection point. We see a sort of slightly increasing in increase in the accuracy data. And overall, we see that opaque collocations have higher predicted probabilities for accuracy in both conditions. What if we also consider phrasal frequency, however? As you can see, as phrasal frequency increases, accuracy decreases in both opaque and transparent collocations. However, in opaque collocations, the decrease is not as steep in the experimental condition as it is in the control condition. And in the transparent collocations, the steeper decrease is seen in the experimental condition. So again, we can see some slight differences, even though the general trend is quite similar. Let's now look at congruency and incongruency. Again, we see some U-shaped learning curves, but this time we see a bigger difference between congruent and incongruent combinations. We see that incongruent collocations are learned significantly better in both groups. And we also see that the retention rates are better for incongruent collocations in the experimental conditions. So we see that even though overall the accuracy rates are better for the control condition, the experimental condition, the learners in the experimental condition are actually able to retain more. Let's now see what happens if we include phrasal frequency. So this is what we see. Again, no stark differences between control and experimental groups, but different trends if we compare congruent and incongruent combinations. So there is a significant interaction between phrasal frequency and congruency. And we see that as phrasal frequency increases, the predicted probabilities for accuracy decrease for congruent collocations and increase for incongruent collocations. So very briefly, what can we make of these findings? So the overall result tells us that the richer input that is typical of DDL does not necessarily lead to overall better language gains in comparison to a non-DDL approach. And this can be discussed quite at length. If we refer to the meta-analysis conducted by Lee and colleagues published in 2018, which is a meta-analysis that focuses exclusively on DDL for acquiring and developing competence in vocabulary, we see that interventions of 10 sessions or more are considered as the number of interventions that are more likely to lead to better results. So we were able to only conduct 8 sessions, so this can actually have influenced the results. Another big theme that is quite discussed at length in DDL studies concerns the opportunity for preliminary training. We did not conduct any preliminary training, but apparently this does not produce any significant differences. So it's something that can be considered, but it might not be decisive. Something else that we saw was the fact that incongruent collocations are retained better in a DDL setting. And this is quite interesting because we can focus not only on the accuracy aspect, but also on the retention aspect. And so basically engaging in DDL activities may actually lead to longer lasting effects in terms of the robustness of learning, thanks to the number of encounters with the target learning items and the way in which the learners interact with these multiple encounters. And the fact that DDL tends to correspond to a heavier cognitive load can actually aid memory as well. Something else that comes out from this study is that opaque and infrequent collocations exhibit better accuracy rates in DDL rather than the non-DDL setting. And this can be, again, attributed to the numerosity of examples, which is able to trigger frequency effects that are not triggered by a simple exposure to the target language input. And also the fact that concordances can allow the derivation of meaning from multiple contexts can overcome the issue related to semantic opacity. So what can be done in the future? Many things, and the many things that can be done in the future all relate to the complexity of the learning aim that I considered. So today I've only spoken about a specific subset of phraseology, namely verb noun collocations, but what I'm talking about can potentially be done with any other learning aims, and even learning aims that concern language skills such as writing, reading, and so on. So But in relation to collocations, certainly the numerous quantitative measures that have been developed lately can be taken into account. Measures such as delta P, which informs us on directionality, measures like log dice, which informs us on association strength, and so on. So there may be differences of DDL effects in relation to these different types of collocational properties. Of course, more focus on retention rates and not just accuracy, just to see how the principles of concordance-based DDL can affect memorability across the different properties of the collocations. And because the 8 classes were quite varied in their actual level of proficiency, it can be useful to look at each class individually. And ultimately, of course, what I aim to do in my future research concerning DDL is to try to see how exactly DDL can help learners, what it actually means to reach the path that other teaching can't reach, and how it can be effective in comparison to other approaches. So in this sense, I think that informing effects-oriented DDL research with second language acquisition, evidence-driven research questions can really help not only in having a more nuanced view of DDL effects, but also making research on DDL relevant to current SLA findings. And ultimately, I think that this can be really helpful in creating links between research and pedagogy. It can really help guide language teachers towards the observation of how DDL can be helpful, and it can really help, I think, to bridge the research teaching gap, which is one major obstacle that has been widely discussed by a number of distinguished scholars, and which may be an impediment to the spread of DDL in many different pedagogical contexts. Here are my references, and that's all from me. Thank you so much for your attention, and feel free to ask any questions or make any comments. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Luciana, and I'm sure that everybody here present would like to congratulate Luciana on a really interesting talk with some interesting implications and questions in general. And then we've also managed to receive some specific questions from the audience as well. But thanks so much for your talk tonight. It's always a pleasure to listen to your presentations and to follow your research in this area. And I guess on that note, we can probably then kick off with a couple of questions that I've received from the audience. And first is related to the length of the treatment. And this is something that you touched upon towards the end of your talk. Question from Mustafa asked that studies on DDL intervention usually feature syllabi of between 8 to 12 weeks. But what is the justification for this? Is there any particular reason why the treatment lasted 8 weeks in your study? And then I guess as a side question, how much is enough?
I think we're very far, generally speaking, from the ideal length of DDL studies. I had a lot of logistic restrictions. I was just not allowed to go beyond the 8 weeks. And I was not allowed to go beyond the 1 hour a week in the 8 classes. So I had to basically choose between involving a high number of classes, but for a limited time, or consider a more restricted sample of participants who I would then have had to teach in my own time. And so in that case, having, I don't know, a group of 10 students and organizing lessons with the group of 10 students for a year would have been possible, but then I would have had only 10 students. So I had to sort of make a decision between those two options. And I eventually went with the higher number of participants. with all the limitations that that obviously involves. So it's really, really difficult to make that decision. Of course, there are advantages and disadvantages with having a high number of participants but lower exposure, and then having a low number of participants and a higher exposure. So yeah, that's my question. Ideally, it would be great to integrate those two kinds of studies. Generally speaking, we really need, I think, to have more longer term DDL studies to really see what the long-term effects are. And something that I didn't speak about was autonomy. That's another great theme. Like, what does it take to make a language learner autonomous in using corpus data? That's one of the great aims that I think we all have as DDL researchers.
Okay, yeah, I mean, it's a tricky thing to answer. I think that, yeah, obviously, the more you could get, the better, and the longer you could go, the better. But I find that in my experience that you're always just constrained by the practicalities of what's available and who's available and how long you've got them for, and the amount of time that the participants themselves are willing to put into working on DDL without large funded projects, which we generally don't tend to see. At least in my knowledge of the DDL research so far, it's mostly still done ad hoc, unfunded, with people who are just scrambling to get as many people in as many places for as long as they can. And that's generally how the interventions, I imagine that most of the interventions reported in the literature of this nature. I guess Mustafa had literally just followed up to say, I'm not sure that longer is the better in terms of exposure necessarily. Engagement also remains a major issue. The longer you keep the intervention, the lower the motivation is by and large. And I guess you'd agree with that too, wouldn't you?
Yeah, definitely, of course.
100%. Okay, thank you. Let's move on to a question from James Thomas, who's also spoken on our seminar series, and he asked about the Chinese students, whether they were, I suppose, different approaches to learning than the students from the other students of Italian, where do you think that there could be cultural or linguistic differences in the different types of participants used, and may that have influenced the results in any way or their engagement with DDL?
Yeah, that's definitely something that can have an influence. I did a very small study in Belgium during my research stay at UCL Louvain with a group of Belgian students, of course, for just a lesson. It was just one lesson, and I gave them the same questionnaire. I just wanted to see how they reacted to DDL activities. And I did one lesson in 2 different classes of Belgian students. And I actually found quite a different response, especially in the more advanced level students. So I think, yes, there can be cultural differences that can play a role, and also, of course, the proficiency level. So that's definitely something that should be taken into account.
Okay. Something that, and this is where I guess my question comes in, is that there's so many factors and variables, right, involved in this. And something that you mentioned in the slide, possible future steps, is that your aim is to ultimately try to identify the conditions that make concordance-based DDL more effective than other approaches. And my question, which I hope is not the kind of gotcha question, but what if you don't? What if you find that it just isn't, and there's just too many things going on that would make any kind of like general answer about the ultimate conditions something very, very specific that may not actually be replicable or even advisable? What are your thoughts on that? what happens if we go along this path and in attempting to find the ultimate strategy, we actually find that it's not something that we would actually want?
Well, of course, that would be a result in itself, but that would mean that what we think and believe about DDL isn't true. I mean, there are many claims apart from the meta-analyses that support the idea that DDL can be more beneficial with respect to other learning approaches for a number of theoretical reasons, because it just makes sense. It makes a lot of sense to us. But what about the empirical side of things? I mean, if it makes sense theoretically, then I would expect it to make sense empirically through the observation of the actual phenomena related to these benefits. Yeah. So, of course, language is highly complex, and there are lots of interacting variables in language use, disregarding the whole realm of second language acquisition studies. So yeah, I'm just curious to see where I get at. But I think that when we talk about integrating SLA in DDL research, the theory has to really go hand in hand with the empirical evidence. Yeah. And then that has to sort of triangulate with the empirical evidence related to language learning studies. Agreed. Outside of DDL. So I think that it's not easy.
Yes.
Of course.
I mean, I would also argue that in tying it in with the theory in this way, the implications for if it does fail are potentially quite serious for theories of SLA in return, in that if we take, say, a usage-based approach to SLA and claim that this is one of the predominant ways in which languages are learned, but then we try to adopt a teaching approach that embraces usage-based approaches to SLA and it doesn't work as well as we hoped it would, that might have major implications for that whole way of doing things and thinking about things. And maybe then other theories may want to kind of step in and say, well, actually, maybe you should try it our way.
Yeah. On that note, what I was just thinking, I was listening to your comment, is that I would be interested in knowing why it doesn't work, if it doesn't work. Yeah. And this is really interesting because the way in which we as researchers and language learners, as learners, interact with corpus data is something that is evolving. I mean, the way in which we create a DDL activity can take up so many different forms. And I would expect that to have a great influence on the possible negative effect of DDL. Yes. So far, I've used paper-based activities for a number of reasons, mainly due to the context in which I work in and the resources that are available for Italian. But one day there might be, as I hope, I don't know, a mobile-based app that allows learners to explore curated corpus data, and that sort of changes everything. So then I would replicate the study with a different DDL tool. Yes. So I see it as a sort of evolving discourse, because the great thing about DDL is that the resource can really be shaped progressively according to not only the learners that you work with, but also with what is possible in terms of technology.
Okay. We got 2 questions. I think time for 2 more. One is from Han Zhong, who asks about the relationship between opacity and congruency.
Yes, I didn't talk about that. I think the scholar Yamashita has investigated with the psycholinguistic task, the relationship between these 2 variables. Of course, a congruent collocation can be either transparent or non-transparent. So that is something else that can be looked at, and it's quite interesting. And this pertains to the complex applications that I was talking about before. So yes, thank you for pointing that out. It's certainly something to look at.
I imagine that the statistical model would likely, or maybe if the other variables were not added, maybe if just the four different options of the two different paradigms, and there was an interaction found between the two, that would kind of answer that question, right? But did you find that at all?
No.
Okay, so we don't know. The jury's still out, but certainly it's a good observation and a good question.
Yes.
So thank you. And then the last question, I think this is also a really good question, given that you were working with quite a few different people. And the question is, how do you control for the possible effect of the different teachers in terms of their different approaches and teaching styles, for want of a better word? Is there any way to account for that, or do you think that that may have had a significant effect, or could that have been added as a random effect, for example, in terms of a teacher number within your model? What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, just to clarify, I was the one teaching all the DDL or non-DDL lessons. Yeah. So I tried to control for that variable directly in that way. So there were no differences in terms of who was teaching the lesson. I could have, some studies adopting the same design just simply considered the control classes as control classes that were taught by other teachers, but that is problematic because you don't really have, you can't really control what is actually learning, what is actually happening in the teaching and what is actually being taught. I'm not sure if the teaching style concerning other learning aims could have had an effect on the specific learning aims that I considered. It's possible. It could be added as a random effect at best, yeah. Probably, but probably not as a factor in the model.
Yeah, I would agree with that, as you said, that because you were the teacher, the impact of the other teacher on the students' engagement with what you were trying to do could potentially be influenced, but I don't really see how you'd be able to control for that necessarily on it, or whether the impact that would eventually have. But I think it was a good question to ask. But that brings us to the end of the time that we have for today's question. So let's thank our speaker, Luciana, again for the second and for the final time for this evening. It's been good. We've had a good talk. We've had a good Q&A session, some interesting discussions, some interesting ideas for future work, and that's something that I think is an indication of a successful seminar. So thanks very much, Luciana. Just before we go, I'm just going to introduce the speaker for next week, and we're back to Tuesday slot. For those of you, we are playing musical days at the moment. I think seems to be a different day almost every week, but the times, they are not changing. We are on 9 p.m. Brisbane time, 11 a.m. UK, and 8 in the morning in Sao Paulo, Brazil, for our speaker next week, Dr. Viviana Cortez of Georgia State University, who's going to be talking about genre and corpora in the English for Academic Writing class, looking at lexical bundles. So do tune in for that around the world, wherever you are. But for the rest of us, let's wrap it up here. And we'll thank our speaker one final time and wish you all a very good evening or good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to kill the recording here and let you all go. Thanks. Okay. Now. Ran, can you make me the host? Because I'm suddenly not the host anymore. And therefore I'm not at, there we go. Now I can stop the recording.